This is Sock. Sock is about to be in this year's holiday card. I'm going to start by constructing an arch to put a fireplace in, and then sort of roughing out to the fireplace. Very extremely rough. I'm trying to play with putting a tree up there on the right, but it didn't really work. So while I'm thinking about that, I think maybe we should add the actual stocking based on the sock in the original picture. Which is why he's called Sock. This is going to take me a little while, just sort of roughing out the shapes a bit. Thinking with lines is sometimes harder than thinking with shading. Of course, we can't just have one sock. We need some decorations on the fireplace. So we're going to put some hanging stockings up there too. Just rough. We'll fix it later. Since the tree didn't work, I was having a bit of a think, and I thought, you know what? Let's have a table. Maybe a table with some spilt milk and some half-eaten cookies. So that's what we're going to rough out just here. And we get to tidying up the logs a bit. This is more sped up than the rest of it, but there you go. These logs are going to take quite a bit of tidying up. Adding in the fire grate properly. Those logs have to sit on something. I was thinking, you know what? Most fires have like a bit of tiles or bricks in front of them, so that it's not just straight open to the floor. So we'll add that in. And I started adding in the actual dividers for the bricks, and then it was a bit, I'm not sure if these are going in the right place. We'll put that in later with some shading. And instead of doing that, let's tidy up that sock, starting with the fluffy top. Right. Let's add in some white on the fluffy bit so we can cover up where Socky is and start on the red. While we're doing red, we may as well colour in these ones, right? But we also need to tidy up the lines on them. So let's do both of those things. A little bit of background colour. Nice sort of beige as a base that should not conflict with anything else. Bit of fire. We're going to start roughing in the stonework around the fireplace. To get the stones in roughly the same place, we put the guides in, but any lines tend to stick to the guides. So use the eraser for that bit instead of the paint. And then roughed in where the tiles should go using the highlighting. Now we can put some lines on those stones all the way around. It's all a bit rough, but that's okay. The stones don't have to be perfectly square. The tiles, however, really need to use straight lines, so I'm using shift a lot here when drawing the lines. Just drawing in around where a rough highlighting went. They're not all the same size, but you know what? That's okay. A lot of this is going to be hidden behind a dragon anyway. Alright, now I think we need a bit of dark behind that fire, just so it pops out a bit more. Because the fire is going to be quite bright, so you won't necessarily see what's behind it anyway. It'll just look darker than the brightness. Now let's get some colour and some shading on these logs that nobody's going to see. But yeah, I know it's there. Little bit of construction helps my brain. Alright, a little bit more help with the shading, and then we're going to rough in some stonework. We're going to give those ones at the front, the bricks or tiles, a slightly different colour. They want to be a little bit more red than the surrounding stonework. We don't want the tiles all the way across, because they should only be in front of the fire, right? So we take out the bits that go all the way across, but now it kind of looks weird, so it needs to be moved up. And then obviously everything needs tidying. Now we have the walls roughed out, we need some lines. Yes, I probably should have used a perspective grid, but didn't. we were adding in a bit of a skirting board because, again, it looked weird at the bottom. And you know, most walls have skirting board, right? So that'll help. We need some texture on the walls and the floor, so let's add in this free brick texture. We need separate ones for the walls and the floor, although it's the same texture, but just we need 2 different copies because we're going to do them at different opacities and try some different blending modes on each one. You know what? We need more dark behind that fire. Now it's time to tidy up the table. We separate out the glass and the plate to different layers so I can play with them on their own. There now, that's a much better table. Now I've also just taken off the adjustment layer that I had on the top to make what's on the tablet look more like it does on the laptop screen, because I was having trouble with picking the colours because it wasn't the colour I was picking because of the adjustment layer. Trying to tidy up this glass by hand just wasn't working, so let's reconstruct it. Trying to add a little lighting and shadow, and obviously our spilt milk. It's the shadow on the back there. Find a blending mode that works. Same thing with the light. And there we go. A glass! Now we need to do the plate. Similar sort of thing. Not quite at the right perspective, but we'll fix that in a second. There we go, that looks much better. We want to add in a cookie and some crumbs. Everything needs lines because that's the style of it. A little bit of shading underneath, and we're good to go. Fire needed a little more dark behind it, so we added that in, but then there was too much. So we've had to take out where it's spilled over. Still trying to make this milk drip look right. Well, now we've added the table and shading on there, obviously we need some shading on the stockings. So let's get to that. Generally how this works is I just add on the darker colour and then use the blend tool to blend it all together. Sometimes it's on its own layer, sometimes, like this time, it's on the same layer as the colour. If you're trying to blend a colour on its own layer and there's nothing that it's blending with, it will sometimes make some weird colour artifacts, which can work for some circumstances. But in others, you just want the dark to blend properly with the colour that you're putting it on. Alright, good. Now we need to tidy up these walls a bit. Just trying to get the in between the stones to be tidy, but I think it's a little too dark, so let's make that a little bit lighter. Now for some lighting, shall we? A little bit of reflected firelight. And then further away from the fire, we'll just have some ambient, slightly more grey light. And then obviously on a different layer, we need to have some shadow at the bottom of each stone. And then once that's laid in, it all needs blending out. Trying out some different blending modes. Sometimes you can hit on something that's really good, sometimes you just leave it where it was. Now the table needs some light. Now for the fun bit. The fire! Again with the blender tool. I do love the blender tool. Just dragging those colours through each other. Trying to make some fun shapes. We also need some at the front of the logs, because otherwise having the logs with just the fire at the back is weird. So we need that fire to be coming out of all of the logs. Same thing again, just laid out in colour, and then use the blender. Kind of blending in a little too much, so we need a third layer in between. Now, while I've been playing with the fire, I've just been thinking, we probably should see the tops of those tiles, right? Yeah, we probably should. So let's put in the tops of those tiles. The great thing about having things on layers is that when you need to move things out of the way so you can see properly, you can just hide the layers. Again, I probably should be using a perspective grid and didn't. Good, let's add some colour on those. And tidy up all that extra lighting. Since we moved the fire grate up a bit to be away from the tops of those tiles, we can now see a little bit of that behind top, so we should add some extra lighting in. I thought, you know what? I think I want to try and puddle this milk that's dripped off the table. And I was trying it, and it wasn't really working very well. Tried to make the floor damp, and I couldn't get that to work. So I gave up on that for a minute and came back to the skirting board, which didn't look right being right at the same level as the bottom of the bricks, because it should be further back, right? So I moved that back a bit and then came back to the puddle, which I still could not get to work properly. So we gave up on it. But we need some things on the floor. We need something, otherwise it's just a big empty floor with sock. So obviously some things probably fell out of the stocking, right, as it was being eaten. The obvious things to be in a stocking is candy canes and an orange. I always had an orange at the bottom of my stocking when I was little. So, candy canes and an orange. It's easier at this point to just paint them in to start with, and we'll add some lines later. I did try adding some textures to the orange, but it didn't really work super well. And then obviously we need to zoom in a bit to tidy up those candy canes, just where the edges are wonky and the pattern didn't work properly. And once it's painted in, we need to give it lines to make it fit with everything else. So, lines. Everything needs a shadow. Everything needs a floor shadow. And the broken candy cane needs a little bit of a shift in its perspective. Those candy canes also need some shading, and then we're good to go. But we need something on the other side, right? So I had a Google of what are other common stocking fillers and found a gingerbread tin. I'm like, yeah, we could do a gingerbread man. That'll work. So I started to draw it out just straight on to start with, and then we can put it in perspective a little later on once we sort of have it. There it is, roughed out. Let's give that a bit of perspective. Throw on some shading, tidy up the edges, and put on some lines. There's a little shading on that icing, although you probably won't see it. Stick in a bit of a floor shadow. Good to go. Now, we move it back to the laptop and it needs a bit of an adjustment. It needs a bit of a levels adjustment because it looks very different than it did on the tablet. Whilst I'm playing with this, deciding where it should go and what gets to have the adjustment and what doesn't, I noticed we're missing a couple of bits of shadow. Like, we don't have a shadow on the sock and we don't have a shadow on the table. So we should probably put those in. And there we have it. Just under 16 hours of painting in just over 30 minutes. Thank you for watching.